The moment you stop observing reality the same way, it changes instantly. Subscribe now, like this video, and comment "Loop Broken" to stay connected to consciousness-shifting content. Once you break the observer loop, your reality changes immediately. But before that moment arrives, you must understand the invisible mechanism that has been shaping your life silently, relentlessly, and with absolute precision since the moment you became aware of yourself as someone separate from the world around you. Because the observer loop is not a metaphor. It is not a spiritual cliché, and it is not a motivational concept meant to comfort you. It is the fundamental feedback system between consciousness and experience, and whether you know it or not, you are trapped inside it every second of your waking life, repeating the same emotional reactions, the same expectations, the same fears, the same desires, and therefore the same outcomes, wondering why nothing truly changes even when you try harder, think positively, or consume endless self-help content, because effort alone cannot dissolve a loop that is sustained by observation itself. And the reason your life keeps reflecting familiar patterns is because your awareness has been locked into a closed circuit, where perception feeds belief, belief feeds expectation, expectation feeds behavior, and behavior feeds perception again, reinforcing the same version of reality until it feels inevitable, fixed, and permanent, even though at its core reality is fluid, probabilistic, and responsive to consciousness. And this is where the observer loop begins, at the moment you unconsciously decide what something means, because meaning is the seed of reality. And every time you look at your life and silently say, "This is who I am, this is how things go for me, this is what always happens," you collapse infinite possibility into a single familiar outcome, not because the universe demands it, but because your observation selects it, just like in quantum mechanics, where a particle exists as a wave of probabilities until it is observed, and the act of observation collapses that wave into a definite state. Your life exists as infinite potential until you observe it through the lens of identity, memory, and expectation. And the observer loop is formed when that observation becomes habitual, unconscious, and emotionally charged, because emotion locks observation into place. Fear, hope, doubt, and attachment all act as stabilizers that freeze reality into predictable forms, which is why people who desperately want change often experience the least of it, because desperation itself is an observation of lack, and the universe does not respond to words or wishes, it responds to states of awareness, and when your awareness is tuned to what is missing, what went wrong, what might fail, or what has always been the case, you continue to observe the same reality into existence, reinforcing the loop again and again, until it feels like fate, karma, or bad luck, when in truth it is a self-sustaining perceptual system. And the most dangerous part of the observer loop is that it hides itself by feeling normal, because the mind interprets familiarity as truth, repetition as proof, and continuity as reality, even though continuity is simply the byproduct of unexamined observation. And this is why you wake up every day as the same version of yourself, thinking the same thoughts, anticipating the same problems, scanning for the same threats, and pursuing the same forms of validation, unaware that your awareness is moving along pre-laid tracks, not freely exploring the quantum field of possibility. And the observer loop tightens every time you identify with a thought, because identification is the moment observation becomes possession, when you stop witnessing an experience and start believing it defines you. And the moment you say, "I am anxious, I am unlucky, I am stuck, I am behind, I am not enough," you have stepped fully into the loop, because now you are no longer observing reality, you are being observed by it, reflected back to yourself through circumstances that match your self-image. And this is why external change never lasts without internal rupture, because even if your environment shifts temporarily, your observation eventually pulls you back into alignment with the familiar, recreating the same emotional landscape in a new setting, a new job, a new relationship, or a new opportunity that somehow feels eerily similar to the old one. And the observer loop thrives on unconsciousness. It feeds on automatic thinking, reactive emotion, and identity-based perception, and it collapses under awareness, but not surface-level awareness, not intellectual understanding, but deep, embodied recognition of the fact that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, and not the story you keep telling yourself about your life. Because the moment you step back from identification and enter pure observation, the loop begins to destabilize. And this is the paradox. Observation creates reality, but unconscious observation traps you, while conscious observation liberates you. Because when you observe your thoughts instead of believing them, they lose their authority. When you observe your emotions instead of becoming them, they lose their grip. And when you observe your expectations instead of projecting them, reality regains its fluidity. And this is where the first crack appears in the observer loop, the moment you notice that you are noticing. Because self-awareness is a recursive function that disrupts automatic processes, and the observer loop cannot survive recursion, because it depends on a single level of perception, a flat, unquestioned viewpoint that assumes its interpretations are facts. But the moment awareness turns back on itself and asks who is observing this thought, who is experiencing this emotion, who is expecting this outcome, the loop is exposed, and exposure weakens it, because what was once invisible is now seen, and what is seen can no longer control you unconsciously. And yet this is where many people stop, mistaking awareness for freedom, not realizing that breaking the observer loop requires not just seeing it, but withdrawing energy from it. Because attention is energy, and wherever your attention rests, reality organizes itself around it, and the observer loop persists as long as you continue to feed it with attention, even negative attention, because resistance is still engagement, and the loop does not care whether you love or hate your current reality. It only cares that you keep observing it as real, solid, and defining. And this is why complaining, worrying, overanalyzing, and ruminating are so powerful at keeping you stuck. Because they are forms of intense observation, reinforcing the same patterns you claim to want to escape, and the universe mirrors intensity, not intention. So the more emotionally charged your observation of a problem is, the more stable that problem becomes in your experience. And the observer loop becomes strongest when identity and survival are involved, because the nervous system treats familiar suffering as safer than unfamiliar freedom. And so it resists change by clinging to known patterns, even painful ones. And this resistance manifests as doubt, procrastination, distraction, and self-sabotage, all of which serve to keep the loop intact, because a stable identity, even a miserable one, feels safer than the uncertainty of transformation. And this is why breaking the observer loop feels uncomfortable, disorienting, and even frightening at first, because you are stepping out of the known and into the undefined, where old reference points dissolve and new ones have not yet formed. And the mind interprets this as danger, because it cannot predict what comes next. And yet this undefined space is where reality becomes malleable, because without rigid observation, the quantum field opens, probabilities multiply, and synchronicities emerge, not because you forced them, but because you stopped constraining them. And this is the critical insight most people miss. You do not create a new reality by obsessively visualizing it while still identifying with the old one. You create it by loosening the grip of observation altogether, allowing awareness to become spacious, neutral, and unattached. Because neutrality is not indifference, it is openness, and openness is the gateway to infinite possibility. And when awareness is open, reality reorganizes itself spontaneously, often in ways the mind could never plan, because the mind plans from the past. But consciousness creates from the present, and the observer loop is always past-oriented, built from memory, conditioning, and expectation, while freedom exists only in the now, in raw perception without interpretation. And this is why moments of deep presence feel timeless, expansive, and alive, because in those moments, the loop is temporarily suspended, and you glimpse what life feels like without constant self-referencing, without narrating every experience through the filter of who you think you are. And the more time you spend in this state, the weaker the loop becomes, because habits of observation dissolve through non-use, and new patterns of perception emerge, patterns that are flexible, creative, and responsive, rather than rigid and reactive. And this is the beginning of immediate change. Not dramatic on the surface at first, but profound internally, because your relationship to reality shifts before reality itself does, and that shift is the true turning point, the moment you stop asking, "How do I change my life?" and start asking, "From where am I observing my life?" Because the observer determines the observed, and until the observer changes, nothing else truly can, and this is the threshold you are approaching now, the point where understanding becomes embodied, where awareness begins to untangle itself from identity, and where the observer loop starts to loosen its grip, setting the stage for a reality that no longer repeats itself, but responds to you in real time, dynamically, unpredictably, and alive. When the observer loop finally begins to collapse, the change does not arrive as a loud explosion or a dramatic external event. It arrives as a subtle but unmistakable shift in how reality feels, because the first thing that changes is not the world, but your relationship to it. And this is where most people become confused, expecting instant miracles while overlooking the deeper transformation already underway. Because when the observer loop weakens, the constant internal commentary quiets, the compulsive need to label, judge, and predict begins to fade. And in that silence something extraordinary happens. Reality starts to breathe again. Experiences feel less compressed, less heavy, and less predetermined, as if space has opened between stimulus and response. And in that space freedom emerges, because freedom is not the ability to control outcomes. It is the ability to meet whatever arises without collapsing into identity, and this is the true breaking of the loop. When observation becomes spacious rather than constrictive, when awareness witnesses without immediately defining, and this shift has immediate consequences, because without rigid observation anchoring it, reality becomes more fluid, more responsive, and more surprising. And this is why synchronicities often appear after deep inner shifts, not as rewards, but as reflections of a less constrained perceptual field. Because when you stop insisting on how things must be, the universe has room to show you how things can be. And the mind struggles with this, because it wants guarantees, timelines, and explanations. But the quantum field does not operate on certainty. It operates on coherence, and coherence arises when your internal state is aligned, present, and open, not when it is tense, controlling, and future-obsessed. And this is why breaking the observer loop requires trust, not blind belief, but trust in awareness itself. Trust that you do not need to micromanage reality for it to unfold intelligently, because intelligence is already inherent in existence, and the observer loop interferes with that intelligence by imposing outdated narratives on present moment experience. And as those narratives dissolve, you may notice old emotional triggers losing their charge. Situations that once provoked anxiety or anger now pass through you with less resistance. And this is not because you have become detached from life, but because you are no longer confusing sensation with identity. You feel fully without becoming what you feel. And this distinction is everything, because emotions are waves, not definitions, and when you stop observing them as who you are, they move, shift, and dissolve naturally, freeing energy that was once locked into self-maintenance. And that freed energy becomes available for creativity, insight, and action that is not driven by fear or lack. And this is where reality begins to reorganize externally. Because your actions change without force, your choices align without struggle, and opportunities appear not because you chased them, but because you were available to see them. And availability is a function of awareness, not effort. And this is the immediate change people speak of. Not instant riches or perfect circumstances, but a qualitative shift in experience that alters the trajectory of your life. Because small changes in perception compound over time into entirely different outcomes, and when you are no longer locked into the observer loop, you stop repeating lessons that were never meant to be permanent, And this can feel disorienting because the familiar drama of striving, failing, and striving again begins to dissolve, leaving a strange quiet where you once defined yourself by struggle. And the ego resists this quiet because it equates intensity with meaning. But meaning does not require suffering. It requires presence, and presence is what emerges naturally when observation is no longer hijacked by identity. And this is where conscious creation becomes possible, not as manipulation but as participation, because you are no longer standing outside reality trying to bend it to your will. You are inside it, moving with it, responding intuitively, and allowing feedback to inform your next moment without clinging to any fixed self-image. And this fluidity is the hallmark of a broken observer loop, because the loop thrives on rigidity, on fixed ideas of who you are and how the world works. And once those ideas loosen, reality mirrors that flexibility back to you, offering new paths, new connections, and new experiences that were always available but previously invisible to your conditioned perception. And this is why people often say everything changed without anything changing, because the same world appears entirely different when seen through open awareness. And over time, this internal freedom crystallizes into external shifts. Relationships evolve or fall away. Work aligns more closely with purpose, and decisions feel clearer, not because you know the future, but because you trust the present. And this trust allows you to move without hesitation, to act without overthinking, and to rest without guilt, because you are no longer trying to prove your worth through outcomes. And this is perhaps the most profound consequence of breaking the observer loop, the dissolution of the need to constantly become someone else, because you recognize that awareness itself is already complete. And from that completeness, action arises naturally, without desperation or attachment. And when action is free from attachment, it is powerful, because it is not distorted by fear of loss or craving for validation. And reality responds to that power by aligning circumstances with clarity rather than confusion. And this alignment feels effortless, not because life becomes easy, but because resistance drops and challenges are met as experiences rather than threats to identity. And this fundamentally alters how you move through the world, because you are no longer trying to secure yourself through control. You are expressing yourself through presence, and presence is magnetic. It draws what resonates and repels what does not, without force or conflict. And this is the natural order that emerges when the observer loop dissolves, an order not imposed by the mind, but revealed through awareness. And this is why the change feels immediate, because the moment perception shifts, reality must respond, not magically, but lawfully, because perception and reality are not separate. They are two sides of the same process. And when one changes, the other cannot remain the same. And this is the invitation before you now, not to believe any of this blindly, but to observe your own observation, to notice the loops you have been running, the stories you have been telling, and the expectations you have been projecting, and to gently, deliberately withdraw your identification from them, not by fighting them, but by seeing them clearly, because clarity dissolves what force cannot, and in that dissolution a new way of being emerges, one that does not seek to escape reality, but to meet it freshly each moment, free from the weight of the past and the anxiety of the future. And this is the true power of breaking the observer loop, not that you control reality, but that you are no longer controlled by your observation of it. And in that freedom, reality changes immediately, not as a spectacle, but as a living, unfolding response to awareness that has finally remembered itself. Here's the question for you: what part of the country are you watching this story from? Drop your state in the comments below.